For 4 days in May 1942, two of the largest naval forces assembled in the Pacific War hunted each other across hundreds of miles of open ocean, and at no point did a single ship from either side ever actually see the enemy fleet with its own eyes. Every attack, every loss, every decision was made based on aircraft reports, radio intercepts, and educated guesses about where the other side actually was, guesses that were wrong nearly as often as they were right. Both fleets got it wrong more than once, with consequences that ranged from tragic to almost farcical, and by the time it was over, the battle had reshaped the balance of naval power in the Pacific in ways nobody fighting it that week could have fully appreciated. This is the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first carrier battle in history, fought entirely blind, and the battle that quietly set up Japan's catastrophic defeat at Midway a month later. By the spring of 1942, Japan had swept through the Pacific and Southeast Asia almost without check, seizing Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and most of the Philippines in barely 5 months. Its next target was Port Moresby, on the southern coast of New Guinea, a base that, if captured, would put Australia itself within range of Japanese air power and threaten the sea lanes connecting Australia to the United States. The operation, codenamed MO, called for two separate invasion forces, one to take the small Solomon Islands port of Tulagi, the other to seize Port Moresby directly, both covered by a powerful carrier strike force built around the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, along with the light carrier Shoho screening the invasion convoy itself. American codebreakers, working the same intercepted Japanese naval codes that would prove decisive again at Midway a month later, had already read enough of the plan to know roughly where and when Japan intended to strike, even though the code-breaking effort at this stage of the war could only reliably decrypt a fraction of what it intercepted. Admiral Chester Nimitz sent two carriers of his own to intercept, the veteran Lexington and the newer Yorktown, under the tactical command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, together carrying roughly 138 aircraft against a Japanese force of similar size. The battle that followed was defined from its very opening moves by how badly both sides misread what they were actually looking at. On May 4th, Yorktown's aircraft struck the newly landed Japanese force at Tulagi, though humid air fogged the American dive bombers' sights badly enough that the results were modest. A destroyer and a handful of smaller vessels sunk, nothing close to what a full carrier strike should have accomplished. For the next 2 days, the American and Japanese carrier forces maneuvered through the Coral Sea searching for each other, at one point passing within roughly 70 miles without either side realizing how close they'd actually come. May 7th was the day both fleets' scouting problems turned genuinely consequential. A Japanese search plane radioed back that it had spotted an American carrier and a cruiser to the southwest. It hadn't. What the pilot had actually found was the fleet oiler USS Neosho and the destroyer USS Sims, on a routine refueling detachment far from Fletcher's actual carriers, nowhere near as valuable a target as the sighting report made them sound. Convinced they'd located the main American strike force, the Japanese carriers launched a powerful attack, dozens of aircraft thrown at what amounted to little more than a support ship and its escort, sinking Sims outright and leaving Neosho so badly damaged she would later have to be scuttled by her own crew, her survivors adrift for days afterward before rescue finally reached them. It was a costly, wasted effort, an entire carrier strike thrown at two auxiliary vessels while the real American carriers sat untouched, miles away, completely unaware how close disaster had actually come. The Americans made a mistake of their own that same morning, though theirs turned out considerably better. A Yorktown scout plane located the Japanese covering group, the light carrier Shoho, escorted by 4 heavy cruisers, but a coding error in the radioed sighting report turned 1 carrier, 4 cruisers into 2 carriers, 4 cruisers by the time it reached Fletcher. Rather than hold back and wait for better information, Fletcher launched everything he had: 53 dive bombers, 22 torpedo planes, and 18 fighters, More aircraft than the target actually warranted, but exactly what was needed to overwhelm it completely once his pilots found only a single, much smaller ship waiting for them instead of two fleet carriers. The American strike found only the Shoho and simply buried her. So many bombs and torpedoes struck the light carrier in such rapid succession that she went down in minutes, taking more than 600 of her roughly 800 crew with her, one of the most one-sided single-ship sinkings of the entire Pacific War. The pilot who radioed the news back to the fleet, Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, delivered one of the most quoted lines of the entire Pacific War doing it. "Scratch one flat top." That evening, having finally realized their morning's strike had wasted itself on an oiler and a destroyer rather than the American carriers, the Japanese carriers launched a desperate late search for Fletcher's real fleet, sending out 27 aircraft as daylight faded and the odds of finding anything at all grew slimmer by the minute. They found the American ships, but American fighters mauled the strike badly before it could do any damage. And in the confusion of dusk and low visibility, two separate groups of Japanese pilots actually mistook Yorktown for one of their own carriers and attempted to land on her deck before realizing their error and peeling away at the last moment. Only 6 of the 27 Japanese aircraft that launched that evening made it back to their own carriers at all. The main event came the following morning. Before dawn on May 8th, both sides launched scout planes, and this time, the search worked exactly as it was supposed to. American and Japanese aircraft located the opposing carrier groups almost simultaneously, and within roughly an hour, both fleets had launched full strikes directly at each other. What decided the day, more than anything either commander actually did, was the weather. The Japanese carriers found themselves partially hidden beneath a heavy rain squall and low cloud cover. The Americans were operating under clear, open skies with nowhere to hide at all. Yorktown's dive bombers found the Japanese carriers first, spotting Shokaku and Zuikaku roughly 10,000 yards apart, with Zuikaku tucked almost entirely out of sight beneath the low clouds while her sister ship remained fully exposed. The American pilots pressed their attack on the ship they could actually see, scoring 2 direct hits with 1,000-pound bombs that tore open Shokaku's forecastle and wrecked her flight and hangar decks, while 16 defending Zero fighters on combat air patrol did what they could to break up the attack. Lexington's aircraft arrived shortly after and added a 3rd bomb hit to the same carrier, though most of Lexington's torpedo planes never found their target at all, and every torpedo that was actually launched that day missed. A reflection of just how unreliable American aerial torpedoes still were at this early stage of the war. One of Yorktown's pilots, Lieutenant John Powers, pressed his dive-bombing run to point-blank range even after his own aircraft had already been hit and set on fire, scoring a direct hit on Shokaku moments before his plane exploded and went into the sea beside the ship he'd just struck, a posthumous Medal of Honor awarded for pressing home an attack he almost certainly knew he wasn't going to survive. Zuikaku, meanwhile, sat almost untouched under her rain squall the entire time, never located by a single American aircraft despite repeated searching. Shokaku, her flight deck wrecked and unable to launch or recover planes, withdrew from the battle by noon and turned for home. The Japanese strike found the American carriers in the clear, open weather that had denied their own ships any cover, and pressed home an attack that hit both American flat tops hard within minutes of each other. Lexington, the larger and less maneuverable of the two ships, took the worst of it, struck by torpedoes and multiple bombs in a fast, violent action. Her crew struggled to dodge given the ship's size and turning radius. Yorktown, smaller and considerably more nimble, weaved through a gauntlet of incoming torpedoes and near misses for several minutes before a single bomb finally found her, causing serious but survivable damage. Aboard Yorktown, an engineering officer, Lieutenant Milton Ricketts, was mortally wounded leading a damage control party to fight fires and flooding from that hit, continuing to direct his men even after being struck himself, actions that earned him a posthumous Medal of Honor of his own. For about an hour after the attack, it looked as though Lexington had survived. Damage control parties brought the fires under control, restored power, and the great carrier seemed to have weathered the worst of it. Crews began the ordinary work of clearing debris and treating the wounded, and reports circulating through the ship suggested she'd come through the attack in reasonably good shape given what she'd absorbed. Then, at roughly 1:45 that afternoon, sparks from an unattended electric motor ignited gasoline vapor that had been slowly leaking from fuel lines ruptured earlier in the attack, deep inside the ship near her central control station. The explosion that followed was sudden and violent, catching a crew that had just begun to believe the worst was over. It set off a new, uncontrollable chain of fires that damage control simply couldn't get ahead of this time, spreading through compartments that hadn't been damaged at all in the original attack and cutting off firefighting parties from the equipment and water pressure they needed to fight back. Over the following hours, the situation aboard Lexington deteriorated past any hope of saving her. Late that afternoon, with the fires clearly unwinnable and the ship listing badly, her crew abandoned ship in good order, and an American destroyer put 2 torpedoes into her hull to finish the job and send her down rather than leave a burning carrier adrift for the enemy to find or salvage. She became the first American aircraft carrier lost in the entire war, taking 66 aircraft down with her. By mid-afternoon, the Japanese strike force reported back to their own commanders with numbers that were themselves wrong in the other direction, claiming they'd sunk 2 American carriers, including what they believed was the larger carrier Saratoga alongside Yorktown, when in fact only Lexington had actually gone to the bottom. It didn't matter to the outcome. Japanese aircrew losses across both days of fighting had been severe enough that only a handful of operational aircraft remained across both Shokaku and Zuikaku, nowhere near enough to continue supporting the Port Moresby invasion force that was still waiting to make its final approach. Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, weighing his battered air groups against the risk of sending troop transports forward without adequate air cover to protect them from Allied land-based bombers already operating in the region, made the call to recall the entire Port Moresby invasion convoy and postpone the operation indefinitely. It was the first time since the war began that a major Japanese invasion had been turned back before it reached its objective. Counted purely in ships sunk, Japan had won the exchange. A fleet carrier for a light carrier is not a trade most navies would call a loss, and Japanese commanders at the time genuinely believed they'd inflicted even heavier damage than they actually had, reporting 2 American carriers sunk rather than 1. But the battle's real consequences ran in exactly the opposite direction from that tactical scorecard. Shokaku limped back to Japan for repairs that would keep her out of action for more than 2 months. Her flight and hangar decks torn open badly enough that normal carrier operations were simply impossible until extensive yard work could be completed. Zuikaku, though physically undamaged and still fully capable of steaming and fighting, had lost so many aircrew and aircraft across the 2 days of fighting that she had no functioning air group left to speak of, and needed nearly as long as her damaged sister ship to rebuild one from scratch. Both carriers, one of them not visibly damaged at all, missed the Battle of Midway a month later as a direct result of what had happened in the Coral Sea, meaning Japan went into arguably the most decisive battle of the entire Pacific War with 4 carriers instead of 6, a gap in striking power that mattered enormously once the fighting at Midway actually began. Yorktown, despite damage serious enough that peacetime engineers would have estimated months of repair work, was patched up in an emergency, around-the-clock effort at Pearl Harbor in barely 3 days, just well enough to sail and fight again at Midway, where her aircraft played a direct role in sinking Japanese carriers barely 4 weeks after she'd limped home from the Coral Sea trailing oil and listing from her own battle damage. Admiral Ernest King, the U.S. Navy's top commander, later described the Coral Sea in terms that captured exactly what made it unlike any naval battle fought before it, the first major engagement in naval history in which surface ships never exchanged a single shot. Nobody's battleship ever came within visual range of an enemy ship. Every torpedo, every bomb, every kill was delivered by an aircraft acting on a radio report that might or might not actually describe what was really out there beyond the horizon. Tactically muddled, strategically decisive, and fought almost entirely on guesswork and imperfect radio reports from beginning to end. The Coral Sea was the first time carrier warfare showed the world exactly what it was going to look like for the rest of the war, and exactly how much could go wrong on both sides before anyone actually understood what they were fighting or where the enemy truly was. If you want to hear how Yorktown's emergency 3-day repair and the missing carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku shaped what happened next at Midway, that's a story we've already started telling. Check the Torpedo Squadron 8 video linked in the description. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.